Amit, shall I begin?
Yes, Shubhadeep, you can start.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shubhadeep Mandal, and I am a research assistant at ICS. On behalf of ICS, I welcome you all to ICS Wednesday webinar. Speaker for today's seminar is Dr. Atul Bhardwaj. He will be focusing on the topic, the Continental-Maritime Conundrum in history and emerging Sino-US scuffle to control global supply chain. The new transcontinental linkages and continental value chains and challenging the monopoly of the international trade management by Western maritime powers. The new wave of globalization emanating from the grasslands of the Central Asia is bringing the 21st century sea power and its hegemony of global supply chain under the severe stress. The five continental powers, China, Russia, and Germany, France, and India, are leading the arrival of the modern transcontinental connectivity networks. The seminar will highlight the German attempt to connect Eurasia using railways in the beginning of 20th century and how it is Berlin-Baghdad rail project that threatened the predominance of sea routes in the plying of the global trade become one of the reasons for the World War I. To speak on this topic, we have with us Dr. Atul Bhardwaj. He is currently a fellow at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. He is an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. He has been visiting fellow in the Department of International Politics at City University of London, senior fellow at the Indian Council of Social Science Research and Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis IDSA. He holds a master degree in war studies from the King's College London and doctorate in history from Ambedkar University Delhi. He is the author of India's American Relation 1942 to 62, rooted in liberal international order. London. Dr. Bhardwaj has been writing a strategic affairs column for the Economic and Political Weekly since 2013. He has several publications in national and international journals and media. Chairing the session this afternoon is Professor Siddiq Wahid, has earned his PhD in the field of Inner Asia and Atlantic Studies at Harvard University, where he specialized in Tibetan and Central Asian political history. He is currently Distinguished Professor in Department of International Relations and Governance Studies and Distinguished Fellow at the Center of Excellence for Relation Studies at Shiv Nadar Institute of Eminence, deemed university. He is also affiliated to ICS as an adjunct fellow and a visiting professor at University of Ladakh in Leh. His other recent engagements have been that of the senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research (CPR), director of UNESCO Patanjit Institute of Kashmir Studies at the University of Kashmir, the Maharaja Gulab Singh Chair Professor in Modern History at the University of Jammu, and he was the founding Vice Chancellor of Islamic University of Science and Technology, Jammu and Kashmir. Before I hand over to Chair, I would request all participants to follow the housekeeping rules. All participants shall remain muted during the presentation. Question can be posed in the chat box during the session or can use the raise hand option during the Q&A. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. I will now hand over the floor to Professor Siddiq Wahid to take the proceeding forward. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and for that introductions, both the introductions, and I will not take much time at all from Dr. Bhardwaj. In fact, I will ask him to speak since he's already been well introduced. I must say that I was very sort of, agreeable to coming to this session and chairing it, provided, as I was saying, I can be a discussant as well in the whole thing, because I think the discussion is what sort of makes these kinds of interactions the most fruitful. Apart from, of course, everything that we're going to learn from Dr. Bhardwaj to begin with. So I thank you. As I was telling Dr. Bhardwaj just a little bit before we began, is that it's been a puzzle to me since for the last 5 to 8 years almost, as to how to concentrate on the Indo-Pacific strategy as well as Himalayan strategy, which to me was lying unaddressed, or not so much in Himalayan strategy, but as a China strategy and things. So I look forward with great anticipation to the talk. Dr. Bhardwaj, if I may ask you to please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Alka, and thank you, ICS, for giving me this opportunity, to share my views on this subject. It's not really new for me. I've been, toying with this idea for some time now. I've been writing a little bit about it, but now the serious kind of research has just begun, and I'm looking forward to new ideas. Looking forward to refine my research questions through this interaction primarily. I don't have a paper at the moment, but this is still work in progress. So I'll begin with this disclaimer, basically. My project, and I'll briefly discuss my project so that you get where I'm coming from, basically, when I'm discussing a little bit of history in this during this talk. The geographic reconfiguration of international supply chains is underway. The world's longest economic corridor, which is linking Asia-Pacific economic pole at the eastern end of Eurasia and the European pole at its western end. So the new transcontinental linkages and continental value chains are challenging the monopoly of international trade management by Western maritime powers. A new wave of globalization is emanating from the grasslands of Central Asia, which is bringing the 21st century sea power and its hegemony of the global supply chains under severe stress. Why I'm saying this is because currently, for a few centuries now, we have seen that 90% of the global trade has been flowing on the oceans. But now things are changing because the 5 continental powers, which is China, Russia, Germany, France, and India, are leading the revival of a modern trans-connectivity networks. So my study is basically aimed at examining these twin themes of connectivity and contestations that is increasingly determining the strategic and the geopolitical choices from a broader multilateral perspective. My study is going to be based on the premise that understanding the control of global ocean commons by maritime powers, first it was Britain and then America, is important in devising our strategies, long-term national strategies. But equally crucial is the appreciation of the role played by the closure of borders in sustaining this maritime hegemony. So therefore, when we talk in terms of closure of the borders, border trades, we need to think that how this is actually helping in sustaining the maritime hegemony. And is it fruitful for us to sustain this maritime hegemony? Is it fruitful for us to open the borders? So the idea of Eurasian connectivity has gained traction irrespective of the Chinese capital. So it's not just that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, has made, although it has, aided in its popularity, but that's not the only reason why this whole thing is coming up. For example, India, which aspires to restore the historical role, its own historical role as a political, economic, and cultural leader, and it wants to create a prosperous society by mid-century, is enhancing engagements with Russia, with Eurasia now. If you see, a very narrow sliver of land separates southern Tajikistan from Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Direct rail from Astana can bring apples to Amritsar in less than 25 hours. However, the geographical constraints imposed by partition of 1947 remain a major roadblock in restoring India's connectivity with Eurasia, with Central Asia. Now, recently, Prime Minister Modi, referring to Pakistan's refusal to give India transit trade access by land to Afghanistan and Central Asia, had reiterated at the 2022 Samarkand summit of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that better regional connectivity is only possible if members grant each other full transit rights. Now, this actually marks India's reorientation away from its colonial fixation with exclusive reliance on sea lanes of communication as the fulcrum of international trade and politics, and its embrace of the modern connectivity imperatives. New Delhi's effort in collaboration with Iran and Russia have resulted in faster operationalization of the international north-south transport corridor, which is about a 7,200 kilometer long multimodal route, linking the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea via Iran and onwards to Northern Europe via St. Petersburg. The transportation of goods through this channel takes considerably less time than the traditional sea route via the Suez Canal and Mediterranean Sea. Further apart, it connects Central Asia, India's Connect Central Asia policy. New Delhi intends to push the idea for optimum use of Chabar port during its presidency, during the SCO, our current presidency of the SCO. So we're basically moving this connectivity idea with quite vigorously in that sense. So India policy of engaging more meaningfully with the heartland is in the process of evolving yet. It has not fully evolved. Now, should India play a constructive role in restoring a land-sea equilibrium? Because India also has maritime borders. So should we, and to avoid a fresh series of hot and cold wars that can adversely impact our own rise. So this is one thing which we have to, our policy planners and our strategists have to think about, that how should we balance this land and sea equilibrium which we encounter in our strategic landscape. The fact is that this establishment of land-sea equilibrium will face resistance. It's not going to go without resistance. At each border post, we're seeing that happening in Syria, we're seeing that happening in Ukraine now. So at each border post, the new trading routes will encounter legal, cultural, and political hurdles. Overcoming these difficulties is likely to delay the evolution of alternative trade routes. If you go back into history a little bit, then you will see that the West drew its power to determine the pace of flow of goods, ideas, and people across the world through control of shipping and sea lanes of communication. Decolonization did not disturb this maritime order, maintained by naval forces and marine service industry, which was largely dominated by Britain. The transfer of power from Britain to America was a negotiated process between the two, where the command of the oceans and the control over the marine service and security industry that regulates movement of cargo at sea passed on from Britain to America relatively peacefully, between the two, of course. However, the current power shift from USA to China is complicated because power appears to be transiting from maritime to a continental power. Now, will maritime world resort to greater engagement with emerging land-based supply chains? That is the question that we have to ask. Or will the process get stalled due to wars as it happened in the beginning of the 20th century, when Germany tried to undermine the importance of Suez Canal by constructing the Berlin-Baghdad railway lines? The three options which I think needs to be explored further is, which are available to the policy planners of the prominent maritime powers to deal with this fresh set of challenges which are emerging in Eurasia, on Eurasian landmass are: will they destroy the land bridges through force? Will they disrupt Eurasian connectivity by employing a split strategy to keep the continental powers divided? Now, this was, as we'll learn a little bit more about Berlin-Baghdad railway, then we'll see how this split strategy was employed. Similarly, the split strategy was also employed during the Cold War, when America weaned China away so broke the caused the Sino-Soviet split, which was the main strategy, the American strategy of the Cold War. Thirdly, will the maritime powers cooperate with the continental powers in establishing the land-sea equilibrium? So anything can happen. And already, if you see, there are tensions on the borders, as I mentioned, in Syria, similarly in Ukraine and elsewhere. We'll see more of these things happening again and again as this, the contest for against this connectivity of Eurasian connectivity intensifies. Now, Britain, the preeminent maritime power in the first half of 20th century, employed the first option, that is, destroy the land bridges through force to tackle the challenge posed by the continental Germany. This resulted in two major wars, because the entire German project had started as early as 1888. In the first decade of 20th century, I'm sorry, not 1888 it had started. In the first decade of 20th century, Britain's policy did take cognizance of Mackinder's postulations on the dangers posed by the Russo-German alliance and the need for a containment policy to tame the continental coalition. So to prevent these the continental countries from coming together has been the major part of the maritime powers strategy. Whether it was Britain, it is America, and it is likely to remain so for some time now. In 1907, Britain moved an alliance with Russia to keep Russia and Germany apart. Britain also contemplated option 3, that is collaborating with Germany in building the Baghdad-Berlin railway lines. However, in the end, the British elite discarded the option and decided in favor of its destruction through the war. The final outcome was both Germany and Britain experienced massive erosion in their power. The only solace for Britain was that America, an insular maritime nation, rose to take control of the maritime order. In the second half of the 20th century, America, the chief maritime power, resorted to a slow split strategy, as I've mentioned, to keep China, Russia, and Germany disengaged. Now, this strategy ensured that the World War was avoided, but it did involve many limited wars in the periphery. Another fallout of the Sino-Soviet split strategy was that America aided the rise of China. The net result is continental China has grown rich, and it now aspires to end the American hegemony. The Russia-China combine has been reactivated, and Germany's continental aspirations have rekindled. So this is the kind of situation that we are in at the moment. It is under this scenario that India is endeavoring to balance its strategic focus between Indo-Pacific and Eurasia. The Indian strategy to sharpen its two-pronged approach to maintain a healthy balance between its needs to keep the sea route safe as well as open, and the land routes that help it expand its trade directly connect with Central Asia. So we are in the midst of adopting a balancing strategy. Will we be able to adopt, or we'll go one way or the other, is the question that policy planners will have to deal with in the coming days. If we, Mark Twain once said, history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. If we see the current rivalry between China and the United States, it holds a sort of uncanny resemblance to the one between Germany and Great Britain in the 19th century. Both rivalries, if we see, take place in the midst of emergence of an economic globalization and explosive technological innovations. Both feature a rising continental powers with a state-supported economic system and challenging an established maritime power of the times. Germany challenged Great Britain and China is challenging United States. Both the rising powers are economically coupled with their respective competitor. That's another factor. I'm looking at Anglo-German duel of the early 20th century. So this is a part of my first chapter of, you can say, of my book, which will eventually should come out, where I'm looking at this Anglo-German duel of the earlier 20th century and trying to understand how it can be a useful guide to understand the dynamics of the emerging Sino-American competition as well as the strategies and tactics that are likely to be employed in this tussle between a maritime and a continental power, a declining maritime power and a rising continental power. Now, China's attempt to connect the unglobalized regions, that is, the inland territories, via infrastructure is not really unprecedented. There are a lot of similarities between Belt and Road Initiative and Germany's Berlin-Baghdad Railway, launched in 1899, with an aim to revolutionize Eurasia's strategic geography. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway, which I'll call sometimes BBR, infringed on Pax Britannica, just as China's attempt to connect Eurasia is impacting Pax Americana. BBR was one of the key factors instigating a rise in tensions that culminated in the outbreak of World War I. By 1870, if you see, Britain was no longer the top industrial power in the world. Germany, Japan, and the United States, and even Russia, had stood up in competition through unprecedented industrial and commercial expansion. Now, it is in this era that rail transportation expanded rapidly alongside the race for naval bases. Railroads facilitated political unification of new territories, improved military logistic capabilities, and acted as a boon for business markets and businesses. Intelligence agencies kept a sharp eye on new developments in the railroad sector, as it became one of the primary reasons for geopolitical rivalry and conflict. For example, the control of railway in Manchuria was one of the main triggers for the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Japan also wanted to stall the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad to deny Russia hold in the Far East. Similarly, the German interest in Baghdad Railway, conceived in 1888, generated suspicion and hostility in Russia, France, and England. Now, this coincided with the rise of Germany as one of the leading trading powers of the world. The German GDP was 67% of Great Britain's in 1871, and it exceeded it by 1908 in the aftermath of the financial crisis. So the German GDP went ahead of the British GDP in 1908. By 1910, German steel production was greater than that of Britain, Russia, and France combined. By this time, Germany registered tonnage of steamship was equal to that of America and 1/10 the tonnage of Britain. Today, we see China has caught up to America economically and technologically. Adjusted for purchasing power, China's GDP was only 25% of US GDP in 1990, after a decade of reforms, but it has exceeded American GDP in 2014. So, and this also happened in the aftermath of a financial crisis of 2008. The speed of German catch-up was as alarming to the British elite then as is the pace of Chinese economic and technological progress is to the American elites now. The German fear then was that the Britain would employ economic or military instruments to halt its economic and geopolitical ascendance. The Chinese fear with regard to America are not very different. Germany invested in state-of-the-art industrial and rail technology in the early 19th century. Berlin started alternative land-based trade routes to challenge British dominance of the international trade. China is also challenging the maritime monopoly of international trade by building land bridges across Eurasia. Lacking the means to build an overseas empire, Germany adopted an Eastern orientation to its policy and thought in terms of establishing its hegemony over Eurasian landmass from the banks of Rhine to the shores of Persian Gulf. by building a 2,500 kilometer long railway line was not just to expand trade, but also to circumvent the British naval supremacy. The railway was envisaged to proceed from Berlin all the way to Baghdad and onward to Persian Gulf. The project was a German national undertaking with its financial institutions supporting it. So the Berlin-Baghdad railway was designed to bypass the preeminent British Navy and also spread German influence deeper into the Middle East and open up Ottoman Empire as an export market and source for raw material. So two things which are to be noted here is the Ottoman Empire at this time was declining. And the second thing is that the oil oil had been discovered in Mesopotamia by around 1908. And so the British and the people were vying for this black gold, as it is called. Infrastructure investments were and continue to be an important element in geo-economic rivalry. Connectivity facilitates growth of new trade routes and avenues for supply chain management. It also provides opportunities for economic and political power projection and disrupt the existing geo-economic order. Much like China, which faces the Malacca dilemma and is wary of US sea power, Germany before World War I too was vulnerable given its reliance on sea lanes which are controlled by maritime Britain. Unlike Beijing, Berlin also pursued blue water fleets, but continental connectivity was an important element in its strategy to challenge the British. Two aspects are fundamental in comprehending the background to the genesis of Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Primarily, we have Germany's economic transformation, an effort to become a world trader. And secondly, as I've mentioned, is the deterioration of the decline of Ottoman Empire. So what we are witnessing today is a repetition vis-a-vis the Belt and Road Initiative and the response of the maritime powers. China's Western ambitions bear a stark resemblance to Germany's Eastern equivalents. One of China's main motivations in pursuing the Belt and Road is similar to Germany's, and that is basically to circumvent its inferiority along the maritime domain. So many could argue that China is now a big maritime power, yet the geography does not support it. So it needs to balance its maritime capabilities with its extension over Eurasian landmasses. So what the Berlin-Baghdad Railway was that the Anatolian Railway Company was created by Deutsche Bank in 1888. In November 1899, Turkey granted the Germans concessions to extend the railway to Baghdad. The projected route from Hyder Pasha on the Asian side of Constantinople to the Basra was to pass through Adna, Angora, Mosul, Aleppo, and Baghdad. Germans were also allowed to establish and operate irrigation projects, harbors, and various industries along the way. The Russians are the first to oppose the railway line passing through Angora. The Germans were quick to accommodate Russian concerns and shifted the line to pass through Konya instead of Angora. So I am sorry I had a map which I'm not able to display here, but I'm sure many of the young students here who may like to Google and they will get this Berlin-Baghdad rail line map on the Google. Immediately you will find this. The British also woke up to the possibility of a German naval base on the Persian Gulf, leading them to establish Kuwait as a protectorate in 1899. So the moment they saw that the Germans are advancing so ahead, they immediately established Kuwait as a protectorate. Now, this effectively barred the railway from a southern terminus on the Gulf. The result was that Basra on Shat al-Arab, 60 miles north of the Gulf, became the proposed terminus. The line as projected therefore ran from Constantinople to Basra, a distance of 2,500 kilometers. Now, the shortage of fund, it is mentioned somewhere that about 16 billion pounds were required to build this line. So obviously there was shortage of funds, which led German company to offer shares in the railways to France as well as Britain in 1902. And some British officials were of investing in this, and so they were in favor of quote unquote internationalization of the project. By late 19th century, railway was a lucrative commodity, which the great powers endeavored to control. So therefore, before 1905, British had actually played down the railway strategic threat because many of them wanted to participate in such an endeavor. Many saw financial benefits of the railways for Britain and as a highway to India, just as it was a trans-Turkish railway. So Sir Edward Grey of the Foreign Office told the Turkish ambassador in 1910 that the Baghdad railway without British participation would seriously modify and was indeed intended to modify the economic position of this country in regard to trade of Mesopotamia, would affect the political situation in the Persian Gulf to determine of the British interest, and assuredly would have important influence in regard to the Indian Empire. So basically, the British were bothered about how this is going to impact the Indian Empire and how it is going to impact the economic dynamics in the region. So they wanted to participate in it. As I mentioned, one option for them was to participate and establish a land sea equilibrium. So the British wanted to participate. But they were also aware, there were many voices in Britain at that time who were suggesting something else, because the impact of railway on the balance of power equation before was nicely summarized by a British scholar who wrote that the Berlin-Baghdad project had already done much to poison the international atmosphere. Germany had come to believe that the opposition of the Entente powers was only part of the general policy of encirclement. Russia, Great Britain, and France had become deeply suspicious of Germany's plans in the Near East. Russia's realization that the Austro-German advance into the Balkans and Turkey must be checked if her own plans for securing control of the straits were not to be thwarted, had much to do with the course of events during the fateful days of July 1914. The German infringement in the sphere of British interest raised alarm bells. The fear of Germanization of Mesopotamia, threatening British position in Egypt and Aden, besides posing a challenge to the Red Sea route to India, became dominant between 1905 and 1909. So this was the perception in Britain, that Germanization of Mesopotamia has to be prevented. David Fraser, he's authored a book which is called The Shortcut to India, the record journey along the route of Baghdad railways. 1909, he had written the book. He said that the maker of line is Germany. By its means, Germany is to colonize Asia Minor, reduce Turkey to vassalage, absorb Mesopotamia, oust Great Britain from Persian Gulf, and finally to extend the mailed fist towards India. So this was the general perception which had built within Britain, and Britain therefore thwarted the project, and it didn't want the project to proceed ahead. It didn't want to participate in the project, and was very clear that eventually Germany intends to reach, through this route, Germany intends to reach India and also extend up to China. So in addition to blocking Germany from access to British or French securities market, Britain put pressure on Turks also to slow down the railways. In cooperation with French, England worked through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration to block the Turkish increase in tariffs, which would be used to finance the railways. So finally, when Germany asked for a conference with Britain and Britain, The English countered by requiring French and Russian participation. The Germans, fearing to be outvoted, refused. So they didn't want to participate in this conference in which Britain, Germany, and France would sit together and question them and their objectives in the region. The policies of France and England, and to a certain extent Russia, constituted a determined and consistent opposition. To allay growing fears of the three countries, Germany handed over the Basra section of the railway concession back to Turkey in 1908. But on the sidelines, it continued to make agreements with France and Russia. So Germany recognized Russia's Persian sphere of influence in 1910. And in 1914, the Deutsche Bank and the French-dominated Ottoman Bank came to terms. France was given northern Anatolia and Syria as spheres of influence, while the German sphere of influence around her railways in Anatolia was recognized. In June 1914, Britain also signed railway agreements with Germany. The agreements involved recognition of German railway monopoly in most parts of Turkey, a stoppage of railway at Basra, British control south of Basra, German monopoly around Adana, British monopoly in Mesopotamia, and making the Shatt al-Arab an open body of water. So this is a kind of agreement which was reached. Britain delayed the construction of the railway, hindering Turkish troop movement during the war. However, British actions contributed to German fears of encirclement and had strengthened the system of alliances which helped make World War I a terribly costly and protracted struggle. The impact of Berlin-Baghdad railway on the European balance of power was one of the overriding stimuli for outbreak of First World War. It led to polarization of political atmosphere. International powers competed for their place in the sun. Eventually, Germany would feel isolated as France and Britain would ally with Russia to form the combine that would lead to the First World War. With all this is the stark reminder that China is currently on our own course to world hegemony through Belt and Road Initiative. We are seeing a repeat of history whereby the Indo-Pacific bloc is shaping up into a security bloc to challenge China's construction of a new economic order. A rail line from Central Europe through Balkans and Anatolia to Persian Gulf would have represented an alternative to Suez Canal. It would have afforded Germany closer links with its colonies in East Africa and Far East, without having to rely on using the Anglo-French controlled Suez Canal or making the long sea journey around the continent of Africa. For London, a major German military presence in Persian Gulf directly threatened its rule in India and threatened the emerging Anglo-Russian duopoly in Persia. In the end, the Berlin to Baghdad railway was not completed before the onset of World War I. Had the line from Constantinople to Baghdad been operating during the war, the Ottoman Empire might have been better able to resist the British advances during the Mesopotamian campaign. The subsequent British conquest of Mesopotamia, including the last-minute seizure of Mosul and the organization of the territory into what would eventually become the nation of Iraq, might have taken a very different turn. Another possibility the British wanted to prevent was an alliance between Russia and Germany. So could have given Russia and German combined greater access to Middle East and Far East, and even to India. The implications of railway entailed one of the two great potential land pass control, and this was to be prevented. So the entire grand strategy, if one sees, is resting on splitting the land pass. If the land pass, if the Eurasia was to become a reality, then the whole global map that we are used to seeing would look very, very different. If the Eurasian combine is there, then then the whole world looks like one big continent, if one was to see it in those terms. So therefore, maritime powers who control the global trade and have been, have maintained their primacy in global affairs for a few centuries now, do not want to see this, the continental powers combining, basically, and building a large landmass. Now, this would undermine, basically, they would not be able to control international trade. If you see, Britain used to control international trade through marine service industry. The marine service industry was primarily about, controlling the freight rates, controlling the commodity rates, controlling the insurance and the reinsurance rates of all the goods plying on the sea. And even now, when you see that, because the Americans now control the financial instruments, the global financial instruments, therefore they're able to impose sanctions. It's easy for them to impose sanctions on any country which they like. So it is to control these instruments that, and now with coming up of new technologies, it has become all the more imperative that new routes which are coming up, new internet cables, new fiber optic cables are being laid by China. So again, now the technological contest has also begun between America and along these land routes. Who will control these things? Because all internet traffic which passes through undersea cables is largely controlled by the maritime powers at the moment. So there is a need for the world. If the world has to become multipolar, there is a need for alternative routes. There is a need to reduce the inequalities between the coastal towns and the inland territories, because as you see, the coastal towns are largely more developed in comparison to the inland territories. So these dynamics are coming up now, and India will have to make its choices. How India plays its strategy in balancing this, its ambitions to connect up with Eurasia through Central Asia, and how it plays in Indo-Pacific is what we'll see in the coming days. Thank you so much. I have finished my presentation, sir.
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot that is that you've put on the table. And I'm particularly delighted because it is so concentrated on the present and exactly what's going on at the moment. So what I'll do is open it up to questions. I'm afraid my technological skills are extremely wanting. So I don't know how to call on people.
Sir, I may assist you on that. We have the option for the chat box or the raise hand option. So if anyone or when they put
Sorry, I just need to, I didn't hear what you just said. So
sir, I was mentioning that the questions can be posted on the chat box, or it can be through the raise hand option.
All right.
So if you may, then I can read out the question as and when they are in the chat box.
Okay. All right. I think I'm in the chat box. It says meeting chat on top. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So any questions that you have? Anybody has? Let me sort of pose the first sort of set of questions, as it were. I mean, Dr. Bharadwaj, I mean, there were, I think, two linchpins in your arguments during the presentation. One was the comparison of the BBR to the BRI. And that, sort of perhaps we can, I mean, implicitly we can learn from that in order to how to handle this. And I think the other, but that was in an environment that was radically different from today, is what I might pose as the devil's advocate argument. And that is that it was in the context of colonial power, number one, where there was no dispute as to, who were the bosses. and who were the underlings, and all the colonial colonies, so to speak, were the sort of underlings on this. And it was an argument that was being carried out largely in the context of Europe rather than worldwide. So that is one of the linchpin. The other is that, that there are sort of, 5 powers that you mentioned, and it is, and my, again, a devil's advocate position is, are there 5 or is there just 2 that we are looking at? Because of various things. And for example, I mean, is it not a question of capacity for any of the other powers that you mentioned, other than China and the United States? So that is those are the 2 sort of I would like to put on the table. And if there are any other questions, I don't know how you would prefer, if you'd like other questions to be made, so that then you can answer them all at a time, or you can go one at a time. So far in the chat box, there are no questions.
So I would go ahead, sir, try and answer some of what you've asked. Basically, I've compared BBR to BRI because it deals with 2 continental powers largely. And of course, they are radically different. The situation is radically different than what it was then and what it is now. However, the 2 continental powers are trying to connect the continent and build a sort of a land bridge, basically, which directly comes in confrontation with the existing supply chains and the existing trade routes, basically. So they're building these trade routes. That's why I've compared these 2. And I've also compared them as to what the reaction of a maritime power was then, and what the reaction of the maritime power is going to be. So I've basically, my framework is, is the maritime continental conundrum primarily. And yes, of course, there was a known colonial power at that time in the early parts of the 20th century, and it had no, it never was apologetic about calling itself an empire. Britain, of course, the Americans would never call themselves an empire, and they've never called themselves an empire. However, there are, arguments whether America is an informal empire, if not a formal empire in that sense. But it is the predominant power in the world. It is the power which controls, it controls, basically, it's one of the, it controls the global politics as such, one could say. Although its hegemony is being contested, like Russia is contesting its hegemony, China in its own way is contesting its hegemony. Even Germany, wants its own strategic autonomy. There is more talk about strategic autonomy now in Germany. So these 3 continental powers are, and so there are, and India was also, as I mentioned in my talk, that through the North-South economic corridor, India is also venturing out to open up its, borders and see them in terms of connectivity rather than just security in that sense. So France is also equally involved. So therefore, and that's why one sees that the European position on China is, sort of remains ambiguous, is not very clear to the Americans and to many others, that what Europe actually wants, because Europe has not been outrightly wants to decouple with China as such. But Europe, when I say Europe, it's largely the French and the Germans, basically. Britain has also disengaged themselves from this continental connect by identifying itself as a maritime power through Brexit. So in that sense, there is a continental push this now. And so one reason, of course, is that rise of China is one of the reasons for this current continental push. And the other reason is that the new economy, the new technology which is coming up is likely to shape these new routes. the internet technology or the online technology probably will favors faster means of transportation, and railways provide that kind of a faster means of transportation, because it takes about if a rail takes from place A to B 5 days, the ship would take about 20 odd days. So this is another thing which is going in favor of continental connectivity. We are further ahead. Technology, in the sense, is the transportation, new transportation means are coming, which is called hyper loops and all that, which are going to make the travel speeds are going to increase to 1,000 kilometers per hour, as is being projected. So we are in the realm of a big technological change, combined with the rise of another continental power at the moment. So that combination, makes it feasible for to discuss these new possibilities which are likely to emerge.
Thank you. I think there was a question from Dr. Ravi Buthalingam. So may I ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, Siddiq. Atul, a fascinating presentation as always, and I can see that you have developed your thesis considerably since we last spoke on the subject. Now, my question really relates to the economics of the land-based and the sea-based routes. As you yourself mentioned, the land-based routes involve huge expenditure on infrastructure, because you have to cover large distances and actually build the infrastructure, whether it is road, rail, hyperloop, or whatever. Whereas in the sea, you already have the medium of the water there. All you have to build are the ships and the terminals at each end. Secondly, you have the issues, as you mentioned, of trade barriers, land barriers, customs, transit barriers, local disturbances, and so on, which across huge land masses can be very forbidding. In fact, China in its BRIs probably noticed that the infrastructure fit may be actually easier than the geopolitical management of this complexity. And all this relates in the economic costs of commodities getting affected. Now, of course, as you say, rail or even air transport might work for small objects, chips, for example, or light objects. But when you're looking at bulk trade, say food grains or wheat or petrochemicals, the economics might work differently. And that is, after all, a very strong determinant. So I'd like to hear your views on this particular aspect.
No, I thank you, Ravi. I fully agree with you. The rail routes are still in their infancy, first of all, and it's not that they can transport everything at the moment. At the moment, railways, the rail routes which are operating now, also from China right up to Europe now, to Germany and to London also, they carry about 300 containers, maximum 500 containers, which is nothing what a ship can carry. So therefore, there are limitations, and but it's growing. And I'm not saying that the rail routes are going to take the entire load from the sea lanes of communication. They're not going to take. But even if with the new economy, with the online economies, demands of the online economies, faster transportation demands, even if the 40% of the global trade moves or 30% of the global trade was to move to inland, on the land bridges, how that is going to impact the global power equations, how that is going to impact the dominance of the maritime powers over the international trade. So that is the basic argument, that nothing, it's not that, we'll have a shipless kind of an oceans. The ships will still ply on the ocean, the ships will still carry trade, but if a large chunk of the trade moves to the land borders, so that is going to firstly expand global trade, because a lot of inland territories are going to get associated. So like now Kazakhstan is become one of the biggest transshipment hubs in this entire rail project. So similarly, so there are new things, new ports, new railway ports which are going to come up in this entire things which are going. So things will change, global trade will expand, the time taken would reduce, and which is going to support the the new economy basically. Of course, the trade barriers will be there, customs, local disturbances are all going to be there. We saw that in Ukraine, how the undersea pipeline was blown away. Who has blown it? Nobody knows till now. But those barriers will come up. But I'm sure they'll be able to negotiate. And unlike the sea, which is dominant, which has been dominated by a single power largely for last few centuries now, like Britain was for some time, controlled the oceans. Similarly, American Navy has been able to, command the global commons for a long time. I don't foresee that happening on the land routes as such, because land routes, if a line has to move through Russia, there is no option for China but to negotiate with Russia. If Germany has to transport its goods, there is no way, unless and until they decide to just go ahead and conquer each other. Of course, then everything gets destroyed. But there are possibilities, and the continental powers now, I think, are becoming more aware of the fact that there have to be continental alternatives to the maritime, sea lanes of communication.
Thank you. May I ask Mr. Subhadeep
Thank you.
Mondal to ask?
Thank you, sir. Atul sir, it was a very enlightening session. Sir, my question is revolving around two things. First, regarding the India's policy in the Indo-Pacific. Sir, as you mentioned that it's a balancing strategy so far that India have. So, what do you think this balancing strategy is it working in the real sense at the real perspective, and in that strategy, how the small island nation that are in the Indo-Pacific region, how they're playing? And second question is regarding the India's long-standing policy of not aligning to any of the major power. So as you mentioned that the history doesn't repeat, but history rhymes. So taking that US, China is behaving as at that time of Germany and Britain. So let's say in the long time come, there will be two blocks that standing. So in that perspective, do you think India will be able to keep its non-alignment strategy, or it has to align to some extent to some side? If so, then which side?
It's a good question. And India, Indo-Pacific, I'm not really looking at Indo-Pacific in this, but India has to balance out, because for the past many years now, since independence, our borders have been closed. We've been following a sort of, our entire focus has been on the maritime routes, But now we have identified, and now we feel that connectivity across borders is very important, and we are endeavoring to establish that connectivity. That's why we are also a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So we are playing the game in Indo-Pacific, but we are engaged in SCO also, and so we've not abandoned SCO as such. So therefore, that you can say it's a de facto non-alignment, that we are playing both ways. We are not abandoning Russia. As Ukraine, after the Ukraine war, there's been a lot of pressure on India to abandon Russia, but we have not done that. Why we have not done that? Not just for the reasons that Russia supplies us some weapons, or because of some other reason, economic reasons alone. But there are also strategic reasons. The strategic reason is Russia wants us to balance China in the region. We want to be engaged with Russia so that we are able to balance China in the entire Eurasian region. So we both need each other more at this time, not just to counter the American hegemony, but also to counter the potential Chinese hegemony in Eurasian landmass. So therefore, we have to be engaged. We have to. There are very little options for us not to be engaged with Russia at the moment. So therefore, we may be opposing China. We may be having border disputes with China, but at no stage we can disengage ourselves from this Eurasian landmass. And even, so therefore, that is our largest strategy. We've been trying to maintain a balancing act. We've been trying to avoid creating, Quad as another NATO. So these are the efforts are on. I don't think India would take a stance that it will become it will devote itself to Indo-Pacific, or it will devote itself exclusively to the Eurasia. So we will play the game accordingly, I think, till the time we acquire the power to say what we want to say.
Thank you. I don't see any hands up, so if I may, I'll jump in with a question that I had, and that has to do with the dilemma that you posed vis-a-vis India, and which way it's going to go. And in that, it seems to me, for example, that there are two issues that I think India is confronted with on that front. Number one is the question of sheer capacity. It's the economically, militarily, how the balance is going to take place between the Indo-Pacific and the borders with Eurasia, which is actually the Himalaya as a whole. And as you know, in a sense, the priority ought to be the Himalaya, because that is a land connect with a 3,000 mile or kilometer long boundary with China, and or 2,000 according to China. That's how distant we are on agreeing on that border area. And I think that one is the issue of capacity, and the other is that economic and military capacity, and the other has to do with whether India engages on the Eurasian or the land front or not, is almost making a virtue out of necessity, because it has to, for reasons of its own security, overall. And I think arguably we can say that it is a boundary that has been neglected for the last 75 years, and we have leapfrogged over it. So in that context, is it too little too late for New Delhi in order to react? And how critical and crucial is it in terms of that? So thank you.
Sir, I would agree with you that the capacities are limited. Both our economic and military capabilities are limited. It's not that, but yet we are, one of the emerging powers. We are a big military power, and not just in terms. Yes, economic capacities. For economic capacities which are on the rise at the moment and which are, going to rise further. Therefore, I think that we would need new land routes. Therefore, it is imperative for us to discover new routes, discover new markets, which are available in Eurasia, so that we are able to transport our goods and services right up to, through the routes which are more economical, which are better for us, basically. So that is one part of the thing. And so balancing, of course, is difficult. And because, we are dependent, now becoming more and more dependent on the US weapons as such, if you see, we are closely strategically allied to the United States of America and also politically in that sense that we are two democracies, so we are, more inclined towards America. In that sense, yes, the balancing is difficult. But as I mentioned, that we have no option. First, for economic reasons, other for strategic reasons, that we need to be in Eurasia. Russia needs us in Eurasia to balance China, for that matter. So, and probably that is one of the strong points that we will, for us to remain there. The other issue is, I would like to ask you on this, since when Musharraf has recently, he expired, and his talks with Vajpayee when he was proposing a sort of, open borders in Kashmir. I don't know, looking at this, should we have actually gone ahead and for the open borders in Kashmir? Because I'm talking purely in terms of the connectivity issues, and now we are actually protesting the CPEC, which is passing through the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and we are also asking Pakistan to open the transit points. So wouldn't it have been better had we were sort of constrained strategically to think in terms of closure of borders rather than opening of borders? So therefore, those strategic constraints, if we work with, 20 years hence, would that have actually contributed now? And we wouldn't have probably been opposed to CPEC. We would have been a participant in that.
Yes, I mean, to answer your question, absolutely, I 100% agree with you. And whereas New Delhi has wasted 20 years trying to get a foothold in Afghanistan, neglecting the fact that there's a bit of real estate called Pakistan in between Afghanistan and us, number one. And number two is that a resolution of the J&K problem would give us land connectivity with Central Asia and therefore Eurasia. And I think that that's been a huge neglect, whether it be out of sheer national ego on both sides, vis-a-vis India and Pakistan, or whether it is, being short-sighted or whatever. And I think that that is one of the major tragedies for us. Quite apart from that is that I think India as a whole has leapfrogged over the neighborhood, because when you look at the Himalaya, when you look at a map, there are independent sovereign states along that area who, with the exception of Pakistan, until very recently, were all looking south for leadership from India, including, may I say, the Central Asian states, and now they're all looking sort of either south or east towards China. And that's the other tragedy, of, I think, our overall situation. And that this is one of the things, and my sort of fear, not pessimism, but fear, is that, have we missed the boat here? And have we missed the rail line, so to speak, just to use your metaphor a little bit. I'll stop there. May I ask Mr. Nagaraj Adve to ask his question, because I see his hand up right there. Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Yeah. So my question, thank you. I'd also put it in the chat box. My question was in the context of the conflict over Ukraine. And given the constraints that Russia faces in exporting gas to Europe, to Germany, and may continue to face those constraints for some years to come at least, how would that influence energy trade between Russia and China? So like in the chat box, Russia's motivation would be monetary, and China's would be to access energy source cheaper possibly than getting it through LNG from the US, and particularly in terms of its energy needs going forward, and because gas is seen as this bridge fuel in a climate change context. So how do you see that dynamic and energy trade between those two countries? And also leading on from that, how would they deal with US discomfort with that trade expanding between the gas trade between Russia and China?
Nagaraj, I'm sorry, I'm not really an energy expert, and I would not be able to answer that question, effectively in that sense. There's a New York Times article yesterday, which talks about how the Russia is managing its oil trade. You must read that. And as I've read, some time back, that Russia is, shifting a lot of its oil towards Asia, and India is playing a big role in terms of, refining the Russian oil and then selling it to Europe itself. So there's a lot of, new equations which are building up, new supply chains which are building up because of the Ukraine war. And but I'm not really an expert. I've not really looked into this particular aspect. But Russia is not really, it's diverted a lot of its trade to oil towards China and towards the other Asian countries, and all are really vying for the cheap Russian oil at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from anybody? I just, one of the things, and I would like to just point this out, in the interest of looking at it in historical context and things, and that is that one of the extraordinary features of the BRI, I think, is the memory of, and this has been proposed, I think, by some people as early as 30 years ago, is that China remembers that in the early Ming dynasty, early 14th century, it abandoned the sea lanes when in fact it was very active in the sea lanes, along the sea lanes at that time, through a man by the name of Zhang He. And it's almost as if the memory of that has created the BRI with such force, so that the belt is the land route and the road is the sea route. One would think that it would be the opposite, given how roads are built and so forth. So it's an interesting thought, and shows a kind of a strategic thinking, which surprised me some time ago. I don't know whether you've looked at that aspect of it, but I think that there's something to be met there.
Well, surely I'll look into that.
Yeah.
Much of that I have not really looked at it. China is, of course, like Germany. China has not abandoned the sea even now.
No, of course.
One of the major now sea powers. Its shipping is it's one of the leading shipping powers in the world. Its ports are one of the best in the world. Most modern ports it is operating. So it's China, and it's in terms of Navy also, it is a little ahead of America now, US Navy. So in that sense, China is balancing both, trying to establish a equilibrium, sort of, maritime continental equilibrium better than the previous powers.
Thank you. I don't know whether but I'm not seeing. Mr. Anantakumar Giri has a question. Could you unmute yourself and please go ahead and ask?
So, thank you so much. Now, your discussion is mainly geopolitical and geostrategic, but all these happen in social, cultural, and political contexts. So my query is, what are the dynamics in terms of social mobilization, civil society initiative, and how it can shape it? Because these geopolitical considerations, they work in particular ways, and if there is an interaction between the social and cultural movements, for a much more equitable and a desirable sense of connectivity. For example, this network on the road, it is not isolated from earlier traditions of Silk Roads. And these roads were not only transportation hubs, but these were cultural hubs of civilizational transactions, And what is your thought on envisioning also bringing a dimension of civilizational transactions and people's creativity on the road, so that it is not just goods and services, but interaction among people?
I would fully agree with you that the roads are not just meant, any linkages are not just meant to transport goods and services, but cultural links are established when roads are established, civilizational links are established, transactions take place, cultural transactions, and that is one of the very important roles that the connectivity plays in that sense. And that is because of the dominance, and that's one reason why we are dominated by the Western thought at the moment, is largely because the West controls those lanes of communication primarily, I would say. And since the closure of borders does hinder that kind of civilizational interactions. And if you see, there is a mix between geopolitics and all that. In between, when Germany was trying to challenge the British hegemony, and the British was trying to drive them out of the Persian Gulf, one of the German strategies was to encourage all the Muslims in the British colonies and elsewhere to rise up against the Britain. And that is, they tried to play that game. So somewhere the geopolitics gets enmeshed with these cultural issues at times. But yes, if the knowledge has to transport the knowledge, so the knowledge production has largely been centered in the Western capitals at the moment for a long time now, because they controls the means of communicating it largely. They controls the lanes through which the knowledge basically passes. So unless and until there are alternative routes, the knowledge which is existing in Asia, or for that matter other parts of other continents, will remain restricted. So therefore, I feel for a more multipolar world, a land-sea equilibrium is a must. To reduce the inequalities between the inland territories and the coastal towns, the land-sea equilibrium is imperative. I hope I've been able to answer your question.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't know how we're doing on time, Mr. Mondal.
Sir, we have 10 minutes of time and there are a few questions in the chat box. Should I take?
Oh, please, can you direct them? Because I don't see it on mine for some reason. So
okay, sir.
if you could just call them to answer.
Okay, sir. So Captain Kiran has posted 2 questions. So first is that where would you place the north-south corridor between Russia, Iran, India? Also, where do you see the BRI going under the current turmoil the world over, in particular the Chinese economic model? And there is also a follow. So should I add that on also, or?
Yes, I think might as well. Yeah.
Okay. And he said that we have missed anything but joining the BRI, and certainly nothing was lost by closing the border trade route between India and Pakistan. So please, would you like to?
Captain Kiran, that is definitely one view, and that is the prevalent view in India currently, that we've not missed out anything, but we've not really disassociated or decoupled ourselves from the BRI totally. I have been opposing CPEC for sovereignty issues, but we are part of the larger BNI financial institutions which support BRI. And we have also been engaging with China, on trade and commercial issues, despite the border problems that we have. But we are also now, one of the policies is also now to look for greater connectivity. And that is one reason that why we are building the North-South corridor, and we are investing heavily into North-South corridor. We have invested in Chabahar port. So therefore, we are not neglecting, we may not, we may be opposed to BRI in certain ways. We are part of the SCO, where a lot of BRI projects are discussed. So therefore, it's not that we have sort of quarantined ourselves from BRI. So that's my only answer to this. Otherwise, yes, our issues are there. We placed our issues in front of China with regard to CPEC especially. And I think, through negotiations, things will get sorted out. Because to both the countries, connectivity is essential.
Sir, may I ask one question? if
Yes,
I may?
please. Go ahead.
Sir, as we have mentioned,
I think you've muted yourself.
sorry.
Okay.
You're again muted.
I don't know, sir, some issue is in the network. Sir,
But
as
say
we
you're not asking a question, then probably it will not mute.
okay, sir. Sir, actually, my question is that now that we have talked about the global trade through marine and the sea route, so now that global warming is coming and there are threats that coming up associated with that. So, sir, how do you think that in the coming up, the time to come, the present scenario in the sea trade and sea route, are they are more immune to that change, or we are looking forward to a big change on that?
No, definitely not, because environment is one big factor which is impacting, shipping also. Shipping is considered to be the biggest pollutant otherwise. And then the rising sea levels, could be another challenge, which could, like Bangladesh, it is said, because of the rising sea levels may disappear. So there are many coasts which may disappear, if the climate change is not mitigated to that extent. So their environmental challenges are huge and big. Both, even on land, environmental challenges are big because of the kind of floods that we are seeing, because of the temperatures, differentials that we are seeing. So these are big challenges which will have to be confronted, whether at sea or on land.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
I don't see any questions unless I'm sort of not being fully there in terms of the technology, but
No, sir, there are no more questions to address.
Okay, all right. Well, Dr. Bhardwaj, thank you very much. I think it's the beginning and of a sort of conversation that I think needs to come to the surface a little bit more, because if I say so, I mean, I don't hear much discussion on this vis-a-vis the strategic affairs community, if you will, in South Asia, in India in particular. And I think that it would do well. So I thank you for this. And personally, I look forward to hooking up so that maybe we can have a cup of coffee or something down the line. So with that, I'll close unless there are other formalities that need to be done. Mr. Mondal?
Sir, yeah, there are a few formality I would like, sir.
Please.
So thank you for your complete remark, Professor Siddiq. Thank you, Atul sir, for your presenting an enlightening remark and your presentation. I think and I hope that everyone that presented will be enlightened and they look forward to such interactive session. With this, we'll wrap up the session. We thank all the participants for joining us. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube platform. For more information related to our upcoming Wednesday webinar will be available on the ICS website, or you can also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.